What's up everyone, King Krabs back again today with a new Monotype discussion. So today I'll be discussing what I think will be the best types to kind of start your journey into Monotypes in the current Crown Tundra DLC. Now I want to make a couple of things clear before we start discussing this. Number one, this is not a tier list. This is not my thoughts on the viabilities of each Pokemon type. These are more so my thoughts on what types I would recommend new players kind of start off with if you're looking to start your journey to Monotypes, be it into tournaments, gym leader challenges, playing on ladder, or to an extent playing in the main game Monotype playthroughs. My second point I want to make is this is mostly for new players. If you're a player who's like in the top 500 or even like maybe in the 1400s on the ladder and you're thinking, hey, I don't agree with you, this video is not necessarily for you. This is for like brand new players or kind of players who are maybe struggling to find their way out of 1200, 1300 on the ladder. Now that said, you're absolutely more than welcome to stay and listen to this video, and in fact I actually encourage you to leave your thoughts down below on what you might agree with, what you might disagree with, because we all have different opinions and I don't want to necessarily give misleading information to new players. If you think I'm wrong, definitely let me know down below. And my third and final matter on this before we jump into the list, these are just my opinions, these are not necessarily fact. This is from my experience playing Monotypes, and at the end of the day you should absolutely just play a type you enjoy. If you don't like some of the types in the top tiers or the top of the list, don't have to play them. This is just a suggestion. I do encourage you to play whatever you enjoy. So one last quick point I want to bring up before jumping into the list. The types within the tiers are not necessarily ordered. So for example, water isn't necessarily strictly better than dragon. They're more or less all on the same level, unless I state otherwise. So first up we have water. Now why I think water is such a good type for beginners is the versatility and synergy it offers. It has such a huge selection of Pokemon to choose from and a great selection of playstyles. If you're a player who favors offense, you can run a rain offense team, which is always nice, as it lets you run a plethora of swift swimmers and boost your already great offensive stab. On top of that, it can really put a dampener on other types that rely on weather, while the water type itself doesn't necessarily have to have rain out to function. Water can also be played very effectively with Stall, with the likes of Regen Cores from Pex and the Slow Twins. You have Lantern and Azumarill covering your only weaknesses with their abilities, as well as providing great team support. Of course, naturally Water can also use a blend of these two styles and play a more balanced kind of team. So I really do think there is a kind of style for everyone out there with Mono Water, and I do definitely suggest giving it a go. So next up we have Steel, which has always been a very powerful type since its debut in Generation 2. And that's no different here in Monos. Steel is a very well balanced type with regards to covering its own weaknesses, of which it only has 3. We can run things like Heatran to cover fire types, a flying type like Corvi or Aegislash, Corvi or Celesteela to cover ground types, and finally we have Aegislash for fighting types. Now Steel isn't only good because of its great defensive typing, it's no pushover on the offensive side either, having great mons such as Scizor, Melmetal and Excadrill, just to name a few, on the offensive side. And finally, it has no lack of access to entry hazards, which can really put pressure on your opponent as you stand firm like the wall your type is. It also has great access to getting rid of those with Rapid Spin and Excadrill. We have Defog on Corviknight, we have Defog on Skarmory. And of course, we are immune to Toxic as a type, which is really good to shut down opposing Stall teams. So I give Dark a spot this high on the list for its great offensive typing. There's no type in the game that's immune to Dark Stab, which is really good to have, but as well as that, there's very little that resists it. So on top of that, it has great access to moves, such as Knockoff would be a great one. The reason Knockoff is so good is a powerful supportive tool knocking your opponent's item off, but as well as that, this is the era of no Z-Crystals and Mega Stones, meaning it's much harder to actually kind of eat those knockoffs, especially if they're stab. We also have Foul Play, which is great for defensive Pokemon, as that can really put the hurt on offensive threats, especially like Swords Dancers or Dragon Dancers, who can threaten the team. Dark has a nice balance of offensive and defensive Pokemon. It has great defensive and supportive backbones with the likes of Mandibuzz, Umbreon. These kind of supportive defensive Pokemon can facilitate the offensive side of Dark, which we have things like Galarian Moltres, we have Bisharp, we have Urshifu, just to name a few, who after some setup can become seriously big threats to your opponent, because there is very little in the tier that resists these stabs. So next up we have Dragon type, and Dragon found its way up here for being carried basically by its insanely high base stat totals. Most dragons are going to clock in around 600, sometimes even more, sometimes a bit less, but overall still just great BST on that end. Now, it's not fair to say high BST alone can carry your type, but it is a great advantage, and on top of that, it has great defensive typing, resisting 4 types, which are quite common in water, electric, grass less so, and fire is quite common as well. As well as that, it just has some of the best coverage in the game, which is super good. This great coverage also goes a long way to helping break through the types that resist dragon, namely steel and fairy types, as it usually has access to poison and steel moves in the form of things like poison jab, your flash cannon, iron head. You also have plenty of access to great fire moves like flamethrower, fire blast. We have no shortage of earthquake to break through those steel types in the tier, so overall I do think dragon is a great type to begin with if you're interested in it. So next up we have some types that are a little harder to play, but still by no means bad types. I'd still recommend these to new players, but they are a little more high effort, so I'm going to specify that when discussing them. So first in this tier we have the fairy type. Now, while I do think fairy is an excellent monotype, there is definitely a bit of terrain management you have to play around, especially if you're interested in using the tapus, which are always a strong option on a fairy team. You have to make use of these terrains, but you also have to get used to changing these on the fly, so every time you swap it between your tapus, your terrain is going to change, and that could change your entire game plan. Bear in mind, your terrains also can indirectly help your opponent, with things like grassy terrain potentially healing them. Now, that said, fairies have no shortage of strong options, and its stab is generally very, very strong. For the annoying steel and poison types in the tier, it goes a long way to have things like mystical fire, which is newly distributed to a lot of fairies. There's great access to psychic types for the poison types, like Hatterene, for example, is a great option. And it only has 2 weaknesses, steel and poison. Both of those are covered quite nicely with the steel fairies. So, for example, Mawile, Magearna, or Klefki. I know Magearna is currently banned in competitive monotypes, but maybe in a main game playthrough, if you're interested in using Magearna, that's definitely a strong option for a fairy team. Next up we have the fire type. Fire type is quite a strong offensive type. They can easily rack up damage quickly by throwing fire moves out, which is a generally strong offensive presence. This is compounded by the fact that Sun boosts fire damage by 50%, as well as decreasing water's damage by 50%, which is one of fire's main weaknesses. On top of that, Sun allows a lot of fire Pokemon to make use of Solar Beam, which many of them get. It's a great grass coverage move for dispatching water types, rock types, ground types, all of which fire types typically struggle with. Now, the downside of fire type mono is that they do rely heavily on their harsh sunlight, and the reason that's an issue is because it's going to be fighting other types for weather dominance, so other types are going to want to try override your weather with theirs. They're also crucially weak to Stealth Rock, which does not help as it's one of the best entry hazards in the game, and swapping your Pokemon is bound to cause issues because you're going to slowly rack up damage. Now, the new heavy duty boots certainly go a long way for patching up that weakness. It allows you to swap your Pokemon in freely without taking damage. Unfortunately, however, that means you're going to have to decide between a Heat Rock or heavy duty boots on your Sun setter, so you either have extended Sun or you're allowed to set up your Sun more often, so making that a bit of a slightly difficult for beginners to kind of get the hang of Mono Fire. So the next type I've listed is Electric, and much like Fire, the offensive presence of Electric is fairly fantastic, especially due to their enormous average speed stat. With access to electric terrain setters, boosting their damage and activating Raichu Surge Surfer, for example, this paired with like Rising Voltage make for a very powerful sweep potential on any electric team. The type also has some of the best synergy in the series, I feel, of any like monotype, just because they complement each other so well. They can easily pivot around with like Volt Switch to grab momentum. They only have one weakness, which is fantastic, and you can have like a Levitator or an Air Balloon, for example, on the team to kind of help that out. So, on paper, this all sounds like it's going to be a fantastic type, like why isn't this the highest on my list? Unfortunately, however, they do have one big downfall, and that is the ground type. Because ground is immune to electric, they can't infinitely just spam their electric type stabs and just kind of get away with it, because ground Pokemon can come in and absolutely halt momentum in that regard. As well as that, the electric type typically has pretty bad type coverage. Like, generally speaking, they only really get electric and normal. Maybe the odd time, if you're lucky, you'll get a bit of grass stab for like those water ground types, grass coverage. not stab. So like outside of things like the Rotoms, their coverage is pretty bad. And as well as that, they're mainly special attackers, so finding a lot of viable physical electric types kind of can be hard. So for that reason, I have listed it slightly below the top tier. But overall, I do think it's a fantastic type if you're able to play around ground types. Fighting type is another quite aggressive type that I have fairly high up on the tier list overall. Having access to a ton of powerful Pokemon, both on the physical and special side, it really has no shortage of wall breaking options, sweeping options, all that kind of good stuff. However, all this power does come with quite a harsh drawback. While a lot of the fighting moves have very high base power, they also have quite negative secondary effects, including like close combat or superpower lowering the user's stats, and focus blast on the special side, which is infamously unreliable, only having 70% accuracy, which will miss when you probably need it most. This makes positioning with fighting types very important, as you don't want to let your guard down and let your opponent reverse sweep you, because fighting types can often not have the best defenses to make up for their like amazing power. This makes them fairly susceptible to being revenge killed, and on top of that, while fighting types love to use like choice locked items, they have to bear in mind they can't infinitely spam their fighting coverage, because there are some ghosts in the tier that are immune to fighting. Thankfully, on the flip side of that, there is no shortage of good dark coverage for the fighting types, so ghost types aren't always the biggest issue. Next up we have Flying type, which I would argue is one of the best types in the game at the moment, if you can play it correctly. However, it does have some tricky team building mechanics you have to get used to. It does have access to fantastic secondary typing, allowing it to almost cover all of its weaknesses and have strong secondary stab, which is definitely one of the biggest things that Flying has going for it. On top of that, Flying itself is a good offensive type, as well as defensively it has access to attacks like Roost, which can easily recover half your HP. However, this does lose your Pokemon's flying typing for the turn it's used, which can be a double-edged sword, as it can either remove your flying weaknesses or remove your immunity to or slash resistances, like for example your Zapdos and you Roost, suddenly you're susceptible to Earthquake, so do bear that in mind when using Roost. It's not as straightforward as other healing options. Where its downfall comes, however, is being weak to the omnipresent Stealth Rock, which means you can often have difficulty swapping it as freely as Flying would like to do. Heavy duty boots is always a great addition to the type, because it does make you immune to these stealth rocks that does bother the team, but it does come at a slight cost of being like not being able to hold leftovers maybe that the bulky Flyings would want, or like a choice Specs or choice Scarf that some of the more offensive Flyings would want, so you do have to give up your item slot if you do want heavy duty boots. I would say overall the type has the perfect balance between offense and defense, so if you are interested in Flying, it mightn't be the most straightforward to get used to, but definitely stick with it, it's a fantastic type. Next up, we're discussing an extremely defensive type in Poison. I think it's arguably one of the best defensive typing in the game, and the type generally likes to play to that strength of being a defensive monotype. I know a lot of people hate Stall, but it has to be said that Poison can play Stall pretty effectively. It can like rack up poison damage with Toxic Spikes, for example, or it's never missing Toxic, and beyond that it can be near immortal due to its fantastic regenerator core in things like Pex, the Slow Twins, Amoonguss, kind of just living forever, swapping out, constantly gaining that HP while you do chip your opponent away. However, while I am singing Poison's praise, there is a reason it's slightly lower on the list and slightly more difficult to play. It is because it doesn't afford too many mistakes. Losing one key defensive Pokemon in your team, or to a misplay, or maybe an unfortunately timed crit, can really send the team as a whole crumbling. Its offenses aren't necessarily bad, but you do have to be cautious of the plethora of steel types in the tier, who can easily wall them out and try to halt your offensive momentum. So next up we have another type that I think is fantastic if played properly, but oddly enough I think Bug is in the position where its main power doesn't come from its own typing, rather it comes from its fantastic access to Pokemon with a great secondary typing, kind of in a similar position to Flying in that regard. This makes Bug arguably one of the more versatile types to play because it has a plethora of strong offensive and defensive options. Unfortunately, however, all of them share a common weakness to Stealth Rock and other entry hazards, which does somewhat hurt its ease of play, I suppose. You'll have to learn a lot of entry hazard control if you want to play Bug effectively. The team loves using entry hazards like Spikes, Toxic Spikes, Sticky Webs, however it hates these entry hazards being used against them. Of course, you can run heavy duty boots as a great option. It's the case for any type that's particularly weak to entry hazards. However, unfortunately, you are giving up your valued item slot on a lot of Pokemon, which is especially bad because a lot of the more offensive bugs like maybe Caesar or Golisopod like to run things like choice items or life orb, so that is a drawback you'll have to put up with. Ghost is the next type, and I think it's in an interesting position. Well, I think it's a pretty strong type in the right circumstances. I also don't think it has access to too many hugely powerful options. The fact is that it's one of the least common types in the series. This definitely hurts it because it has less Pokemon to choose from, meaning a lot of them will have the same Pokemon being ran, which is not the biggest downfall, but it is certainly maybe a lack of variety can be a downfall. That said, its ghost stabs are typically pretty good, just to throw out there, as it isn't a huge amount of Pokemon in the tier that resist it, outside of Dark, and Normal is immune. Luckily, Normal is a very uncommon secondary type to be attached to a Pokemon, so unless you're actually fighting a mono-normal team, the chances are of you fighting a part-normal Pokemon are quite slim. Ghost generally gets good access to fighting coverage as well to deal with the two aforementioned types, which is nice to cover your weaknesses. On top of that, Ghost does have access to some cool tricks and traps like Toxic Spikes. It has access to its own unique curse. It has access to a lot of trick, some prankster Pokemon and stuff like that. So it's not the easiest type to play, but can be rewarding if done right. So in the final tier, we have types that I think require a lot of commitment or knowledge to learn to play to its full effectiveness. I don't necessarily think these are bad types. I just wouldn't personally recommend them to newcomers to the Monotype format until you've somewhat learned the ropes of how to team build or how the meta works in general. That said, if you are interested in these, by all means do not let me stop you. These are still types you can easily pick up and play. If you want to, they're just somewhat harder to learn than some of the easier types, I feel. So first in this tier I have the Ground type. While Ground has a fantastic offensive presence, it's not as easy as just clicking your stab Earthquakes, for example, to rack up KOs, as there are so many different ways to become immune to Ground. For example, being Flying type, having Levitate, or holding Air Balloon, to name a few. On top of that, Ground generally relies fairly heavily on its Sandstorm to be up in battle, to chip damage the opponent, as well as to activate abilities such as Sand Rush and Sand Force. While ground Pokemon are seriously strong under these conditions, it's often hard to fight for weather dominance, especially because you're often going to be fighting against weather dominance, against water type or ice type, both of which you'll struggle with. Ground is also a fairly aggressive type, meaning it can struggle to beat some defensive tactics like Substitute. However, on the bright side, it does have great control over hazards, such as Spikes and Stealth Rock, as well as having plenty of hazard removal options on their team. So definitely a good type, but does take a bit of learning. So next up on the list I have the Ice type, which shouldn't come as a surprise to a lot of Pokemon players, because Ice generally gets a bad rep for kind of not being a great type. I don't think that's necessarily true in the mono format. I think Ice is pretty good this generation, but it does have its struggles. I think it's undeniable that of all types in the game, Ice is one of the, if not the best offensive presence in the game, being super effective on a plethora of types, especially when you take into account Freeze Dry, which is super effective against water types which otherwise you could struggle with. Unfortunately, on the flip side, its defensive typing is truly awful and arguably the worst in the game. This makes Ice types a Glass Cannon kind of archetype, which can make it hard to survive, being Revenge KO'd for example, or Priority can be a huge struggle for the team. While these are slightly patched up by the ability to use Aurora Veil, which is a fantastic move, I'd say necessary move on any Ice team, this does however require you to win the Weather War to set it up, which is not always possible with the Ice type, because other weather types can give you a lot of trouble. When mastered, Ice can be a very scary offensive presence, but certainly not one I would say is as easy to pick up and play as other offensive types, so I would bear that in mind if you are interested in playing the Ice type. So Rock is next on my list, and while I think it suffers a lot of the same fate as Ice type, the Rock type might strike you as a defensive type, but I think Rock teams are generally played quite the opposite. Fast offensive Rock is actually a great way to play the type, which might seem a little counterintuitive. And the reason for that is because Rock has an absolute laundry list of weaknesses that are almost impossible to cover on any one mono Rock team. So for that reason, people generally don't build a defensive Rock team. While offensive Rock is pretty good, Rock is a decent offensive typing, it does suffer with the fact that such a few of its moves are 100% accurate, most of them being 90 or below, meaning you can easily miss an attack of a crucial moment, something that most types don't have to constantly worry about. While it does like to have sand type as well from the likes of Gigalith or Tyranitar, it's not an absolute necessity for the rock type, so that is something that you don't necessarily have to have complete control over. As well as that, it actually has access to really good entry hazards, which makes sense as Stealth Rock is a rock type move. But as well as that, it has pretty good access to spikes and sticky web from things like Shuckle. So overall, a decent type if you can play it right, but maybe a bit counterintuitive for newcomers. So next up we have Psychic type. Psychic is a very cool and unique type, and I do believe it can be quite strong if played right, but I do feel that the type has a huge learning curve and takes a lot of commitment to learn. Its general mediocre speed means it can struggle with fast threats in the tier, such as Fast Ghost, the plethora of knockoff users, and the dreaded Volcarona. Some Psychic teams rely heavily on the Trick Room to patch up their inability to counter these speedy menaces, which is not often the most reliable or easy to set up in a singles format. On top of that, building Psychic teams isn't necessarily always as straightforward as building other teams, as it does break some of the norms of team building, as we've seen some high-level Psychic players actually start to run itemless Pokémon just to be immune to the opponent's Poltergeist and to weaken the plethora of knockoff users in the tier. So things like that are kind of a quirk that only you really see on Psychic types, so do bear that in mind if you're looking into playing a Psychic type team. So next up we have Normal type. In my opinion, Normal varies massively depending on the generation. However, I feel that this current generation, as we currently stand, it's not in the best position. It does lack some fantastic options this generation due to the lack of Z Crystals and Mega Stones, for example, Z Conversion Porygon Z and Mega Lopunny. That said, Normal still has some of the most varied and unique Pokemon in the tier, which can't be denied, as well as having second to none in coverage. It is unfortunately lacking in some key threats, and its offensive presence isn't the best because its stab isn't super effective on anything and has 2 resistances and 1 immunity. It's not so easily thrown around. Its defensive typing is pretty good, only being weak to 1 type. Unfortunately, however, that type is fighting, which is a fairly common offensive threat or offensive coverage move for that reason. As well as that, it has a great defensive backbone in Chansey and Porygon 2, who are some of the best defensive backbones in the game, can easily cure themselves of status or heal themselves up. However, both of them are extremely susceptible to being knocked off, as the team needs to keep its EVO light to keep its defensive backbone in check. On top of that, it has very few ways to deal with entry hazards. I'm pretty sure the only defoggers currently in the tier are some of the normal flying Pokemon who have access to defog, which get rid of your own entry hazards, which overall is not the ideal situation. So lastly, we have Grass type. Unfortunately, as a Monotype, I feel the playstyle is contradictory. Its moves make it seem like it should be a defensive type, with many of them having draining or healing properties. However, as a defensive type, Grass is far from good, having common weaknesses across the board. So where Grass shines is somewhat ironically in the Sun, and the reason that's strange is because Sun does actually boost fire damage, which is not ideal for the Grass type. However, Sun does offer it uncharged solar beams. It can turn its Weather Ball into fire type, which is great for dealing with things like steel types. It also activates abilities like Chlorophyll and Leaf Guard. The type unfortunately has no access to Drought currently, meaning it has to manually set up Sun, which is not so easy in fast-paced games. On top of that, the Sun actually makes it much more difficult to fight the fire types because you're affording them a increased damage, as well as weakening your own water type moves, meaning it's even harder to take down said fire types. So overall, I don't think it's necessarily a bad type, but I think it's counterintuitive to build and can struggle to keep up in a lot of faster paced games. So it's not a type I'd recommend to newcomers. It's a very high effort to learn, but if you are interested in Grass type, I do recommend still trying to play it, just maybe not as a first type. So that is going to be it from me for today. And I'm very interested, what type did you begin playing Monotypes with? How did you find learning them? Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Definitely let me know down below in the comments. I'd love to have an open discussion about that. And of course, if you're a new Monotype player or a returning player and you have any questions whatsoever about any specific type, let me know in the comments down below and I will try to get around to answering them all. Finally, if you did enjoy this, feel free to like and subscribe as it helps me out a ton, and don't forget to share it with a friend who might find this useful or who might be interested in getting into Monotypes. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoy. I hope you have a great day. Take care.